Thank you. And this is a great conference, and I'm very happy to be part of it. I'm, in a way, neither an ethicist by training nor an Adam Smith scholar, so I'm looking forward to the discussion. But I do hope to that my particular perspective on Adam Smith will contribute something. I became interested in Smith through being interested in empathy and the contemporary discussion of how to understand other minds, whether we use a kind of implicit scientific theory or whether we use ourselves as a model, putting ourselves in the perspective of the other person and simulating their thoughts, etc., etc. And in some sense, Adam Smith, from that perspective, is one of the first, as we like to call it, simulation theorists. But he is not only interested in simulation or empathy, sympathy as a means of understanding other people, but as a means and as a central mechanism for evaluating other people. And I think he's quite right about that. And so what I'm interested in the last 2 years is kind of develop a way of thinking about the foundation of moral judgments in a context in which I think empathy and sympathy becomes central. So here's my take on Adam Smith. So what I try to do first is I try to situate Adam Smith both in the contemporary metaethical context and in the historical metaethical context. So as a start, what are the central questions that are interesting to, or I think that are essential to address insofar as we try to delineate and analyze the phenomenon of morality from a philosophical perspective? I think if we have to account for morality, then in some sense we have to also provide an account of why morality or moral phenomena are normally regarded to be very central for us as human beings, that in some sense we do care and we in some sense should care about moral issues. But the question is, why is that? I care a lot about a lot of things. Why is morality in some sense so central for us as human beings? Why is it not like having a good dinner? That's also something we care about. And the dinner yesterday was great. And so that seems to be something to care about. And morality is one of these issues. But the issue is not just why we do care about it, why we should care. Why do moral judgments express, in some sense, an obligation for us? And so that's the normative dimension of morality that I'm particularly interested in addressing. That's the question that Kant himself addressed when he asked, how is a moral categorical imperative possible? Why is it that moral judgment make demands on us? The second question I think that one also has to address is the idea of morality in some sense is associated with a certain kind of intersubjective and universal validity. It's not just something that is valid for me or you, but when we make a moral judgment, we in some sense think that it's valid for all times and all places. So if we think that slavery is morally wrong, it was wrong and it is wrong, not just now because we changed our mind about it, but it was wrong even though some people thought it might be a good practice. But I try to account or address that question of the intersubjective and categorical validity of moral judgments, not necessarily by first asking. Some people want to say that moral judgments are intersubjectively valid because they are moral facts. Some more moral facts are out there in the world, and our moral judgments are true or false because in some sense they correspond to these moral facts. I think if you address the question of intersubjective validity, in that sense you always run into some kind of problems, and the problem is, why should we care about those moral facts? Facts normally are not something that we have to care about. So what is it then about moral facts that makes them in some sense interesting for us? And I think that question is a question that is very difficult to address. So I think first let's think about the intersubjective validity and see whether we can account for that, and then the question of whether or not there are moral facts follows from that. But here's, I think, one of the most fundamental metaethical difficulty, and I think that's the difficulty that also was driving the debate in this 17th and 18th century, and that is how to square a realistic account of human psychology with the universal scope and intersubjective validity of moral judgment, since human motivation and psychological mechanisms seem to always be situational, local, and rather of limited scope. So if you want to explain why we should care about morality, you have to do that in light of a realistic moral psychology. The psychological factors that you have to appeal to seem to be of limited scope. Is there any way that we then can provide an account of morality that addresses both of these questions? Okay, and I think Adam Smith is very useful to think about this difficulty, and that's what I try to do in this talk. Okay, so what is the metaethical context of Adam Smith, where those questions were actually addressed? And this is the way Adam Smith himself thinks about the context. So we have the proponents of self-love, what I called hard-nosed and cynical psychological realists. It's all about me, 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 and I'm so vain. That's particularly Mandeville rather than Hobbes. The advantage here seems to be, yes, there seems to be a dimension in our psychology that seems to be only self-interest. So they seem to get the psychology right. That's all self-interest. What else could drive us? The problem, obviously, is that if you think about morality this way, it seems to disappear. Moral agency seems to be impossible because the moment you think about that anything good that you do, you figure out that it is done only for self-interest. You give to charity, or some politician kisses a lovely child. They obviously don't do it because they really love the child or they want to give to charity. They do it for self-interest because they want to look good. Now, that seems to mean that everything good in the consequences from the motivational perspective doesn't have any moral worth. So self-interest seems to deny the possibility of moral motivation, selfless motivation that we need to make sense of moral agency. The second aspect I think that one has to think about is, if you think with Hobbes, morality, the distinction between something being morally right and morally wrong seems to come down to the following kind of concept. Something is morally right, an action is morally right, in some sense if self-interested rational agents could agree on such a principle. The question is, why should they agree on any kind of moral principle? The answer is because they're rational. But then there seems to be a reason for agreeing on such a principle. If there's a reason, then the reason seems to exist independent of people agreeing on principles. So the agreement is not constitutive for morality. Morality seems to be something out there, seems to be a moral fact. And Hobbes and Mandeville cannot account for that. That was basically the comeback and the objection of the so-called rationalist and realist, and here we have Cudworth Samuel Clarke and Price. Their reaction was, no, absolutely not. You do have some obligations whether you like it or not. They are independent moral facts, and it's reason's task to recognize and intuit them. So the idea here was, it's not just self-interest, but we have rational capacities to recognize something as being true or false. Among them are the facts of nature, mathematical facts, but also moral facts. And the idea is that moral facts are at least like mathematical facts that can be intuited by reason. So here are two representative quotes by Clarke. The first is the objection against Hobbes. Now, if the destruction of mankind by each other's hands be such an evil that to prevent it, it was fit and reasonable that men should enter into the compact to preserve each other, then before any such compact, it was manifestly a thing unfit and unreasonable in itself, etc., etc. So, where do you locate those facts? In some sense, Clarke seems to suggest these are relations or properties of the things in themselves, and it's the function of reason to recognize those moral truths. Now, the problem is, why should we be interested or be motivated by the recognition of such facts? Now, these rationalists tend to be Platonist. They claim that knowing that something is right or wrong also motivates us in a certain way. But they take that as a basic fact of human psychology without giving an explication of that very fact, and it seems to be wrong. It seems to be wrong to think that we have to be motivated by a recognition of any kind of facts. Those facts seems to be weird. My example is always, if I know that there's a nice frozen yogurt shop on Highland Street, Woolbury, then knowing that fact doesn't necessarily motivate to go to Highland Street or to the frozen yogurt shop unless I have a certain kind of desire. So recognizing any kind of fact doesn't seem to motivate me. Why should I care about that fact? Unless I have a desire or a passion for ice cream, frozen yogurt. And so, as Mackey, contemporary metaethicist, says, moral facts seem to be rather weird if you postulate them. And what realists don't seem to provide us is with a reasonable moral psychology. They leave the field of moral psychology behind. So what you have in the 16th, 17th century is, on the one hand, you have the moral psychologists that get the moral psychology right. We are all self-interested. That seems to be right. On the other hand, you have these realists who say they are moral facts, but they don't explain why we have to care about them. And in that situation, you have to, or in this context, you have to basically see the moral sentimentalist, Hutchinson, Hume, and Adam Smith. As Hume famously declared, reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. So, reason's function cannot be to provide us with moral guidance, because reason and the recognition of truth somehow doesn't seem to be motivating. We have to appeal to sentiments. That obviously seems to suggest that morality in the end has to do with our attitude towards the world than rather how the world really is, which leads to a kind of anti-realism, subjectivism. It's us who projects moral properties into the world, then we recognize moral properties. Okay, now Smith in some sense clearly aligns himself with the sentimentalist tradition. But I think he does it only because he doesn't find the alternatives that I talked about particularly persuasive. What I would like to argue that in some sense, in his discussion of the impartial spectator perspective, he transcends the limits of sentimentalism. And you just to give you a preliminary indication of that, when he talks about the impartial spectator perspective, he also talks about reason, principle, conscience, the inhabitants in the breast, the man within, the great judge and arbiter of our conduct. So the impartial spectator is also the reasonable man, not only the man of passion. So what I think the manner in which I want to interpret Smith is closely aligned to what nowadays is called constructivism. And historically, that always is linked a little bit to Kant and the idea that we account for morality not by locating, situating it in the world out there, not by locating it in the realm of our mere passions or mere desires, but rather by locating it or explicating it as something that is essential to practical reason, that our capacity as rational agents is to be able to deliberate about the reasons that we are acting for, and that the structure of that deliberation is such that it commits us to certain kind of moral norms. And so this kind of constructivism conceives of the objectivity of morality as, in some sense, being stance-dependent, but insofar as you are Kantian, the idea is that there is some inescapable structure that all agents deliberating about their reasons have to be committed to. And I think that the arguments of Smith, at least I think the more successful arguments of Smith for the impartial spectator perspective can be read in this manner. Now, nowadays one also distinguishes between Humean and Kantian constructivism. What I want to suggest is I'm particularly interested in Kantian constructivism, the way Korsgaard's explicates it nowadays. I don't find Kantian constructivism in the end successful, but I want to suggest that we can think about constructivism more constructively when we look at Adam Smith. So let's look at Adam Smith. So what is the fundamental problem? Now the fundamental problem is, let's just assume that with Smith and Hume, that they showed clearly that we are not just self-interested, that we also have benevolent motivation, altruistic motivation, and there is the capacity for sympathy and empathy with other people. So Hobbes is wrong. Nevertheless, sympathy as a natural phenomenon is restricted, is exposed to what we nowadays call the here and now bias. That is, we tend to sympathize more with people that we know that are close to us in several dimensions, spatially close, but also closer in terms of personal relations. So we sympathize more with a friend who's far, far away than with a stranger right here. We sympathize more with a stranger right here than a stranger down there. So sympathy, if we think of it as the fundamental psychological principle underlying moral judgments, has a problem. That is, there has to be some way of overcoming the restricted scope of sympathy. Now, both Hume and Smith do that by appealing to what Hume calls the fixed, steady, general point of view, and Smith the impartial spectator perspective. Because morality has to do with universality and not with personal relations. So we abstract from being friend and foe in making moral judgments. Now the problem is, if we assume that sympathy is limited, but that morality in some sense forces us to take a more universal perspective, how then can we explain the commitment to this impartial spectator or the general fixed point of view. And that is not merely a causal question. It's a question, why should I adopt that stance? That is, what is it about me that should make me treat another person as somebody who is not friend or foe, but a kind of human being? And the answer cannot be, we should take that perspective because we do make moral judgments. That seems to be Hume's answer, but that seems to be circular. It doesn't explain the question, why should we make moral judgments? And I don't see very much in Hume that allows us really to answer that question. I think Hume quite correctly appeals in the inquiry to what he calls conversations of mankind. That is, conversation of mankind allow me to surpass and transcend my more limited perspective. Causally, that's probably right. The question is, why should I do it? Conversation with mankind, in the end, is something that to a certain extent makes me universalize my perspective, but it doesn't really explain the normative dimension of all of that. Okay, so I think in Smith, however, we will find some answers. And that requires us to take a quick look at his account of propriety and merit and how exactly I want to understand what's going on when we approve of another person's actions. Okay, so here's how sympathy works, I think. Sympathy allows us to put ourselves in the perspective of the other agent and allows us to bring the agent's sentiment and thought home to ourselves. We are able somehow to simulate it in our own mind, and because we simulate it in our own mind, we in some sense approve of that. Sympathy is also oriented not towards the inner mental realm. I don't just look at the face of the other person. But in sympathizing, Hume always stresses that we look at the situation in which the other person finds himself. I don't fully understand the emotion the other person is in just by looking at his face. I have to understand in a way what caused him to be angry in some sense. Okay, these are the two general claims that he makes. Now let's look at propriety. He says, to approve of another person's sentiment, we must not be only affected in the same manner, but we must perceive this harmony and correspondence of sentiments between him and ourselves. The perception of harmony is linked to an agreeable and delightful emotion. It's that emotion in which the sentiment of approbation properly consists. So, we put ourselves in the situation. We find that certain thoughts, sentiments occur to us. We figure out whether or not our sentiments correspond to the other person's. If they correspond, we perceive that agreement, and that supposedly gives rise to a delightful emotion. In that sense, I think he wants to be part of the sentimentalist tradition. Therefore, he emphasizes this kind of delightful emotion. Now, Hume pointed already out, and people after him, from an empirical point of view, all of this is a little bit problematic, because is it really the case that we agree, when we observe agreement, we have a delightful emotion and approve of that emotion or that thought? I think that's wrong. Think about somebody who you can't stand. Hopefully not one of your colleagues, and you figure out that person has the same opinion that you have. It might not make you enjoy that fact. It might actually make you give up that opinion. It can't be right. So that's problematic. I actually think what's happening here, Smith doesn't fully understand what he actually means when he says sympathy is not solely oriented towards the inner realm of the other person. We are actually not interested in figuring out whether the other person has the same kind of sentiment. We actually figure out whether the situation provides us with a reason for having certain sentiments, having certain thoughts. And if we can reenact and simulate those reasons and those sentiments, then we agree. So what's going on here, I think, is we treat the other person in sympathizing with him as a rational agent who responds in an intelligent manner to his environment. And if we can simulate that reason and that intelligibility, then we approve of it because we regard him and recognize him as a rational agent like myself who is intelligible in the same manner. That also, I think, allows us to unify Smith's account of sympathy throughout propriety and merit. That, for example, allows us fully to understand why Smith insists that romantic love cannot be sympathized with. Why not? Because it's completely idiosyncratic. There's no rhyme or reason for falling in love with that particular person whatsoever. It's just accident, chance, nothing to be sympathized with. It's always silly. So look at merit. Merit requires us to, in a way, have a complicated shift of perspectives. We have to sympathize with the gratitude or the resentment of a person receiving a certain kind of action of the agent. But we first have to sympathize with the intention of that agent. If the intentions are proper, we recognize that the gratitude is appropriate, and we properly feel gratitude and can share the gratitude. So we cannot indeed enter thoroughly into the gratitude of the person who receives the benefit unless beforehand approve of the motives of the benefactor. And so upon this account, the sense of merit seems to be a compounded sentiment, to be made up of two distinct emotions: direct sympathy and indirect sympathy. But notice, there is no agreement of sentiments here. It doesn't matter what the other person feels. The action deserves merit if there's reason for feeling gratitude, regardless of whether the subject feels the gratitude itself. He might be a completely ungrateful person. But that doesn't mean that the action doesn't deserve merit. So what's happening here is that actually judgment of merit and demerit are then based on our reenactive ability to recognize the proper reasons for a person feeling gratitude, resentment towards the agent in light of information of the agent's motivation. So what's really important, I think, is understanding the reasons for which a person, another person, has certain sentiment, feels certain emotion, justifies his thoughts. Okay, the question now is, why is this all relevant, normatively relevant? Why should I care about moral judgments that are based on sympathy that conceived in this manner? So you say, you don't agree with me. You don't approve of my sentiments. And I say, fine, I don't care. Now, one answer to say is that we actually do care. We do like to be loved. We do like to be friends with a lot of people. Facebook. I mean, that's why everybody seems to be on Facebook, to be loved. The question is, that's just a causal account. That would make moral judgments like peer pressure. And that doesn't seem to be right. When I make a moral judgment, I don't address you as a person whom I want to pressure. I address you as a human being whom I think has reason, a normative reason, to follow my judgments. Now, if we think about sympathy in the way I just accounted for it, and that's my favorite way of thinking about empathy in the first place, and so I'm quite happy that Smith agrees with me in this respect, then I think we can also account for the normative dimension. Because if I can't sympathize with you, if I'm unable to reenact your reasons for acting, what I'm basically saying is you're completely unintelligible. You're not a rational agent. So the disapproval is in the form, yeah, that makes sense to me, or I just don't get you. Why do you do it? It's completely unintelligible. And in some sense, I challenge you as an agent who acts for reasons. We are agents who make sense of our own agency by being able to say something in favor of our action. If I'm actually claiming that doesn't make sense whatsoever, I challenge your very existence as an intelligible agent. I say, you are outside the realm of intelligibility. And that's normatively relevant for how you conceive of yourself as being somebody who does have reasons for acting. Now, so far, we are just dealing with a one-to-one, with a interpersonal relation. That is, I try to put myself in your perspective, I'm unable to do it, and I say, you're just not intelligible. Now, why should the other person take that seriously? Why shouldn't he just say, the reason why you can't reenact my perspective is because you just project yourself into what I'm doing. And so, isn't that just self-projection? That's irrelevant. It's a form of self-love. Why is that relevant for me? Now, Smith has two answers for this. He clearly says the sympathy, the way he conceives of it, has nothing to do with self-love. And here we have to distinguish between what's normally called self versus other-oriented perspective taking. So what Smith claims is that when he talks about sympathy, he's not just talking about projecting your own perspective onto the other person, but taking into account relevant differences and, in some sense, not think how I would act in that situation, but think how the other person would act in that situation. So think about somebody who is from a different religion or believes that the earth is flat. How would he think in that situation? You have to basically take into account the relevant differences, imaginatively entertain the idea that you think that the earth is flat, quarantine your own perspective from that kind of imagination, and then think, how would that person act? And then you might understand the other person. But now the problem is, in taking the other-oriented perspective, you might understand the other person, but in some sense you didn't bring the case home to yourself. You can understand why he did it, but that doesn't mean that you approve of that action. You understand the reasons from his perspective, but it's still not something that you would approve of because you didn't fully bring it home to yourself. Now the other answer is the impartial spectator perspective. Smith says it's neither self or other perspective taking. Moral judgment really has to do with judging the other person and reenacting his thoughts from the impartial spectator perspective. Now again, the central question is, why should I be committed to something like the impartial spectator perspective? Now, Smith suggests that we have a desire of praise and desire of praiseworthiness. I don't think that the language of desire here is particularly helpful. I might have a desire for vanilla ice cream and I might have a desire for chocolate ice cream. And my desire for vanilla ice cream is stronger than my desire for vanilla ice cream, chocolate ice cream. Now that might explain why I'm quite happy to get chocolate ice cream if they are run out of vanilla ice cream. But it certainly doesn't explain why I should be tormented if I get only vanilla ice cream but no chocolate ice cream. That doesn't seem to explain it at all. So the question is, why should I be committed to the impartial spectator perspective? Now I think in Smith there's a second strand of thinking about the impartial spectator perspective, where he says that this impartial spectator is the highest tribunal of appeal. And I think that is something that we should think about. So here is how I like to think about the impartial spectator perspective and our commitment to the impartial spectator perspective. That is, I regard it as a device in bringing things home to myself outside the scope of anybody's self-love, either mine or the other person. And here's a quote: before we can make any proper comparison of those opposite interests, we must change our position. We must view them neither from our own place nor yet his, neither with our own eyes nor yet his, but from the place and with the eyes of a third person who has no particular connection with either and who judges them impartially between us. Now think about perspective taking again for a moment. So the default perspective is self-projection. I project myself in the other person and assume I can't reenact the other person's thinking. He's culturally too far apart. Second attempt, I now adjust my perspective taking, take into account all the relevant differences, imaginatively take on a few pretend beliefs, desires, commitments, etc., etc. Now, I can reenact the reasons that the other person has for his action, but only from his perspective. By the way, I don't become the other person. I'm still aware of the fact that the person whom I'm reenacting and me are different people. But I, in some sense, can recognize why the person did what he did from his perspective. I understand his reasons. The question that arises now is, what do I do with that fact? And I think it's important to recognize that I reenacted reasons. So there's a certain amount of pressure that's put on me. I have to question myself. Now, from his perspective, it seems to be completely intelligible. From my perspective, that doesn't seem to be the case. But which perspective should I really take? There's a pressure to a certain extent to mediate between perspective. I have to ask myself, and what's the right reason to act in this situation if different perspectives could come to different answers? And I think it's in this context where I appeal to a perspective that's neither mine nor his perspective. And that is something of the impartial spectator perspective. And that's the reason why I'm committed to the impartial spectator perspective, because in reenacting the other persons, we are actually reenacting reason, subjective ways of making sense of our own agency. Okay, so a few concluding remarks. So the standard of impartiality, I want to say, it's not one among a plurality of standards to appeal to. There's no question of what higher standard of perspective to appeal to. Rather, that standard is an a priori commitment for agents acting for reasons who grasp and negotiate each other's reasons as outlined before. Impartiality at least implies that we are but one of the multitude in no respect better than any other of it. I think within the consequentialist literature, for example, it's not at all clear how they would justify the standard of impartiality. I can compare to Kant's universality of reason requirement. Maybe we can talk about that in the discussion. Now, most importantly, while impartiality in this sense is an a priori commitment, the question of whether impartiality has been realized in a particular judgment can be empirically challenged. It is in this very context that questions about biases in our empathic capacity or other shortcomings of our cognitive capacities are of central importance for the impartial spectator perspective. And I think we should read the theory of moral sentiments as exactly contributing to reflecting on the nature of the impartial spectator perspective. As Adam Smith has, in my opinion, already emphasized, reflection on the nature of the impartial perspective and how various factors influence or corrupt our moral sentiments has to be seen as being an integral part of the impartial spectator perspective itself. It's here that considerations from empirical psychology can prove to be helpful. Different kinds and degrees of normativity. I think the consideration above allow us to distinguish between different kinds and degrees of normativity. From my perspective, norms traditionally regarded as norms of rationality and norms of morality have to do with the fact that norms of morality are in some sense constitutive of the impartial spectator perspective itself, of treating the other as a person who acts for reasons. So killing the other person seems to not do that. The normative force of more localized norms, however, can be understood as the fact that patterns of disposition that exist in a certain society are considerations that speak from the perspective of the impartial spectator perspective as considerations in favor of acting, choosing, desiring, and so on. And last but not least, the final metaphysical thoughts. On my account, normativity is stance-dependent. It's constitutive for fact, being an objective normative reason that it can be grasped from the impartial spectator perspective as a consideration that speaks for an action or adoption of a certain attitude towards the world. Being stance-dependent, however, does not necessarily mean that normativity is less real. It means only that it is as real and natural as the stance on which it depends. But the stance that agents as natural organisms with a certain organization of their brain take towards each other in order to make sense of their behavior as intelligible agents is not something that can be explained away or that we are free to negotiate about. The stance is part of the natural world, even if it is a stance that does not have its equivalent in the natural sciences. And with that, thank you.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Karsten. Is this on, by the way? Yes, okay. If we have a Kantian reading of Adam Smith's moral theory, the question that would occur to me then is essentially, why does he write The Wealth of Nations? Because Kant didn't write something equivalent to The Wealth of Nations. And presumably for Kant, insofar as morality is in universal human potential, a poor man can be as moral as a rich man. A concern with increasing the wealth of nations wouldn't seem essential or terribly important to that kind of perspective.
That's a good question. I'm not sure I will give a sufficient answer, but obviously Adam Smith wasn't just a moral philosopher and a meta-ethicist in some sense. I mean, what I'm focusing on in some sense are part of the revisions that came in later, when moral philosophers actually objected him to his original theory. He's obviously very interested also in accounting for psychological mechanisms that have to do with explaining why human beings are social human beings and why it is that they form peaceful societies despite what Hobbes is saying, right? So he is actually also a social scientist. But I think what he wants to do in the end is he wants to address the question of why we should care about morality by situating it in the social realm, by situating or linking it essentially to the psychological mechanisms that are also responsible for why we are social creatures. Now, if he just does that on a causal level, he would not address the normative question. So in some sense, the account of why morality is a kind of universal phenomenon, has universal validity, would be not addressed whatsoever. So in order to do that, he has to both locate it in this kind of social empirical realm, but at the same time I want to suggest, and he doesn't fully do that, I think. His sentimentalism, I think, stands in some sense in the way. But I would like to read him to say that in being social creatures, we basically endure a certain kind of commitments to a certain kind of impartial spectator perspective. And I think what Smith wants to say, this is more realized in some sense socially, not in a feudal state, but in a more capitalistic state, where we actually primarily see each other as agents acting for reasons, rather agents who have a certain kind of social position.
Karsten, I don't know if you'll find this to be out of bounds, but I wanted to ask a question that partly comes from my work on Levinas. And it has to do with the whole notion of, I know it's way out of bounds, but it has to do with the whole notion of constructivism, right? I mean, at one point you said, okay, we're moving beyond, kind of the sentimentality idea because it's not only the face of the other, but it's the situation in which the other exists and so forth. And that's what seems to lead you to a kind of constructive approach, emphasizing reenactment and so on. But I would suggest in some ways that the situation is itself immanent, right, in the other person. And I mean, through it all, I'm not convinced that the whole thing works in terms of reenacting reasons, right? So if you could, convince me more that this is a constructive process. And I'll give you a very concrete example. One thing that I've been thinking about a lot recently has to do with my mother, who has dementia. And how it is that I think about the moral domain in light of that. I don't think that there's anything that I'm engaged in when I'm being moral with her that has to do with reenacting her reasons or anything of the sort. I think it's much more unmediated, right? That doesn't mean that we're leaving it only to the passions, but nor does it necessarily mean that we're engaging in a kind of constructive reenactment. So where are you on that?
First of all, I think that's a very good question. I don't think it's out of bounds, even though normally Levinas is out of bounds. But here's, I would say, so Adam Smith talks primarily about moral judgments, not in the sense that you're moral with your mother. In a way, I would want to say you're with your mother. You're not, concerns about morality are really irrelevant. You are just in that situation, and the situation takes you in some sense. Right. So now the question is whether that's moral, right? So that's the spectator perspective. And here I would say we take on a more universal perspective. But I think one thing that I like about Smith that's not in Kant. Smith wants to say, in evaluating that situation, we are not abstracting from our ordinary, normal ways of being with each other. So we would agree with that because, yes, that's what everybody experiences insofar as relationships to mothers are. So the impartial spectator perspective is not the spectator who's completely dispassionate. Rather, we would see it as moral because, yes, that's what we expected some to do in those kind of situations. So I think there's a room for saying that's impartial, but at the same time universal, because the impartiality doesn't mean that you abstract completely from ordinary human emotions.
Is the impartiality a secondary process, or is it primary?
I think it's you wonder where you get. You have to ask yourself. You can't just say that. Oh, I'm with my mother. The question whether that's moral or not, whether everybody should do that comes in secondary in some sense, as a kind of evaluative dimension. But obviously, you have to look at this specificity of the situation. But what we evaluate is a situation of this time. So in being with your mother, you don't take a universal perspective. When you make a judgment, you evaluate a situation of a specific type, being with your mother in this particular kind of situation. And that's the kind of impartiality.
I'm going to explore the question of to what extent, if any, Adam Smith was a utilitarian. As I'm understanding it, being a utilitarian is being someone who holds that the fundamental standard by which whatever we're evaluating is to be morally evaluated is its actual or expected impact on overall welfare. So utilitarian will say of character traits, the ones that are the virtues are the ones either that actually have the best impact on overall welfare or are of the type that can be expected to have the best impact. So let me start with a commonplace observation people make on reading The Wealth of Nations, which is at the center of The Wealth of Nations seems to be a very attractive utilitarian defense of a certain kind of market economy. The idea is that there's a kind of psychological state people exhibit, that's a kind of moderate selfishness, a pursuit for the interests of themselves, their family, and their friends. And if only we develop a market economy with the right structure and limitations, that psychological trait will turn out to redound to the overall benefit of society. And it looks like a pretty straightforward, elegant defense of markets on utilitarian grounds. It's as if by an invisible hand, each was moved to take that option, the pursuit of which contributes to overall welfare. Let me stop for a second on that observation. Any worries about that? There are fewer students here than I was anticipating. I'll pick on the 4 of you. Everybody's okay with this observation. Okay. It's a natural thought, then, to move to his moral theory and expect, on reading a theory of moral sentiments, that you'll find a defense of utilitarianism in some form. And I think it's a striking and important fact that you don't, at least immediately, find utilitarianism in a theory of moral sentiments. Indeed, when he turns to various systems of moral theory, he attacks straight out the system that puts utility front and center as the standard of virtue and vice. So there is, as Tim number 1 from yesterday pointed out, the Adam Smith problem. When you get from the Wealth of the Nations back to a theory of moral sentiments, you find both his account of human psychology and his account of morality seemingly to be very different, moving from utilitarianism and the justification of the pursuit of self-interest to an account by which our psychological capacities are much more expansive, we can care about much more than our own self-interest, and the standard of virtue is not utilitarianism, but something different as it emerges the impartial spectator. So I want to get us to the impartial spectator and try to find places to turn Smith back into the utilitarian. Argue that all of those places fail, and at the end of the talk, the reason they fail is because Smith had a really deep insight into the nature of our normative concepts. An insight that, for instance, Hutcheson completely lacked, and Hume saw only dimly. So let me begin the process, and now I'm going to be using your PowerPoint in effect. Smith starts out in talking about our moral judgments by pointing out that they focus, first of all, on the motives, intentions, psychological drives of the people we're evaluating. And we evaluate them along 2 fundamentally different dimensions: propriety and merit. So in judging of various actions, whether they're proper, we put ourselves, as he thinks, in their place, ask of ourselves in their place, in their circumstances, would we similarly be motivated to perform the action that we're evaluating? If we discover we wouldn't be motivated as they are, the lack of sympathy leads us to disapprove of what they're doing. If, on the contrary, in their circumstances, we too would be so motivated, the recognition of the sympathy, of the identity and the motives, leads us to approve of their acting in the way they did, on the grounds that we too, in those circumstances, would so act. Propriety, he thinks, is, in many contexts, a very low bar. A lot of actions are proper and not admirable. To be admirable, they have to exhibit some extraordinary, special kind of accomplishment. He, at the same time, thinks of various actions that aren't proper. Some of them are admirable, where doing the proper thing is very, very hard. People who approximate it but fall short. doing so much more than normal people would do, secure our admiration despite our thinking of them that they acted properly. The other dimension, merit, is, as was nicely pointed out, much more complicated. On Smith's view, to approve of some action as meritorious is on putting ourselves in the situation of the person affected by the action, seeing whether we would feel gratitude or resentment under those conditions. Whether we would feel, as we're thinking about gratitude or resentment, depends in part on whether we see the motives of the person who would have the effect as proper. So in circumstances where considering the action as proper, putting ourselves in the place of the recipient, we would feel gratitude. We would then approve of the action of the agent as meritorious. If, on the contrary, it was resentment that we would approve of, on the grounds that the agent was not acting properly, then we would disapprove of the action as not meritorious, as meriting resentment and often punishment. Now, this setup, as was nicely emphasized, is an entirely psychological story. There's nothing normative in this really yet at all. It's a story of what we would or wouldn't approve of, why. For Smith, observing, emphasizing as he thinks of it, that we distinguish between securing approval and meriting approval, between something being approved and its being approvable. His challenge is to move from facts about what we happen to approve of to judgments about what merits the approval, what's praiseworthy or blameworthy or approvable or disapprovable. This is where the impartial spectator comes in. And I want to flag something that didn't come up in the talk before that occurs in Smith but gets downplayed as the editions go along. So early on, Smith offers a quasi-developmental view of the emergence of thoughts about what's approvable. That quasi-developmental view starts with the observation that we each find ourselves approving and disapproving of people, and then realize they're doing the same to us. And finding ourselves then, this is sort of a brute fact about our psychology according to him, wanting their approval once we realize that they're approving or disapproving of us, and then facing a problem. There's virtually no course of action which will garner the approval of everyone. And so now we have to pick out whose approval to secure. And he has a nice little story about the extent to which getting approval for things you didn't do, or getting approval for things you did, but not for the reasons people thought you were doing them, is really not to get approval for yourself for what you've done. And so part of the desire for approval, that's an approval that will be satisfied, is to get approval for what you actually did for the reasons you actually performed. This is where you start to limit the approval you seek to the approval that's for what you actually did, for the considerations on the motives you actually acted on. But that's not enough to get universal applause for the things you do. Again, you will find, inevitably, no matter what you do, even when it's understood by other people, not everyone will approve. And so again, in the quasi-developmental story, he says, you end up having the fix on someone who knows what you did and the circumstances you did it and on what motives, who would approve of you, where that approval is universal for all people like that. And he proposes the impartial spectator is just such a person whose approval would meet that condition. That you you've got impartial spectators whenever you have spectators who've eliminated as influences on their approval anything that would lead them to disagree in their approval of you. This is very much like Hume's account of the general point of view, where the development of the general point of view is specifically the attempt to identify a point of view where if people succeed in taking it up, they all will approve of the very same things. Smith's suggestion is, having sought out such a point of view and found it in the impartial spectator, you've found the standard of approvability, that our concept of being approvable, as opposed to our concept of being approved, is the concept of garnering approval from those who are impartial spectators. So when you get to the question, the normative question, that was being pressed before, on my understanding of Smith, you get a very different answer than was being proposed. And I want to take an opportunity, this is sort of off track, but just to set up a panel for a lot of discussion and incitement. The question that was being pressed is, you've got your own point of view, you've got the point of view of the other person, why should you care about, say, the other person's point of view? And as Karsten developed the story became, well, you shouldn't really specifically care about the other person's point of view. What you should care about is the point of view of the impartial spectator. Do I have that right? What's puzzling is, on the constructivism setup you had, what's the answer to that question? Here am I at my self-interested point of view, and now I have the impartial spectator point of view. I could ask myself, why should I care about what an impartial spectator would approve of? On my understanding of Smith, the answer depends on appreciating what the question is mobilizing. To ask, why should I care about something? You're mobilizing a normative concept. And what Smith purports to have done in his quasi-developmental story is tell you what the criterion is of that concept. So that Smith's answer to the question, not what do I care for, but what should I care for, if he's right about the criterion of normative concepts, is the question, what would garner approval from the impartial spectator? This can sound frustratingly circular and unsatisfying. And towards the end, I'll say why I think it's neither trivial nor unsatisfying. But I want to flag that on my understanding of the normative question, a crucial component is mobilizing the concept he's given us the criteria for, which is not what was on the table before, if I got that right, Karsten. Right. Okay. Okay, so let me go back on the path I meant to be laying. We've got utilitarianism playing a primary role in Wealth of Nations. Turn to a theory of moral sentiments and ask, so is Smith a utilitarian? First thing you discover is he gives you an account of our moral evaluations being of actions as proper or meritorious. That's our approvals. He then raises the question of various approvals, which one has it right? Which of the traits that are approved of as meritorious are meritorious? Those are exactly the ones that merit approval. To merit approval is to be such as to garner approval from the general point of view. So far, the setup is supposed to be strictly analogous to an empiricist account of judgments of color or shape or relative size. It's one thing to find yourself with various reactions to the world as of there's something red, and something distinct to judge of the thing that looks red to you, that it is red. What's the difference? The first is to have a certain sort of experience. The other is to mobilize a concept of redness and be asking yourself, would it give rise to this kind of experience under certain appropriate circumstances? So that we should distinguish with redness between a story of things looking red to us and they're being read, specifically by appeal to how they would look under certain specified conditions. Smith is doing the same thing here. In talking about what's approvable, we start with experiences as of approving, and then distinguish between the veridical ones and the non-veridical ones, that is the ones that have as their object what's approvable, as distinct from those that just garner the approval. We distinguish them by appealing to what would garner approval under certain privilege conditions. The privilege conditions are the conditions of the impartial spectator. So you might think, and so, for instance, Tom Campbell argues, you will get utilitarianism out the far end once you understand what a truly impartial spectator is. A truly impartial spectator is, in effect, an ideal observer, equisympathetic with everyone who's affected, moved by the thought of how the actions would contribute to overall utility. So the idea is, sure, Smith gives a primary role to impartial spectators who focus on propriety and merit, but a properly constructed impartial spectator will be a spectator who, in her approvals, consistently approves or disapproves in proportion as the objects of her approval and disapproval either contribute to or frustrate overall welfare. And since she sets the standard for what's approvable, you have the functional equivalent of utilitarians. So a lot of people argue, reconciling wealth of nation with theory of moral sentiments, that once the impartial spectator is on the table and once the impartial spectator is properly understood, you get the foundations of the principle of utility out the far end. Okay. Good so far? Puzzles? Okay. The problem here is that when you read Smith's account of the impartial spectator, the account he seems utterly content with. And this is, remember, his account of the standard of our moral judgments, presumably of his moral judgments as well. One thing he emphasizes is that the impartial spectator is heavily influenced by some interesting peculiarities. I'll just run through a few, give you an evocative example he gives. The point of it is, Smith's account of the impartial spectator is clearly not an account of someone who's equisympathetic with all who might be affected. So, let me just mention some of the peculiarities. One of the most interesting is precisely because judging according to the impartial spectator is judging according to how someone using her imagination would feel on putting herself in our place or in another person's place. The judgments of the impartial spectator are heavily influenced by the nature of the imagination. And it turns out the nature of the imagination is such that it is much more capable of bringing home the pleasures of other people rather than the pains, and the psychological pleasures and pains of other people rather than the physical pleasures and pains of other people. This has various important impacts. The one I most love, just because it was so evocative, is Smith in noting this asymmetry between the pleasures and pains of the imagination and the pleasures and pains that are physical, registers the fact that in circumstances where a person might lose a limb, the person suffers a much more severe loss than she would suffer if she were to lose a lung. But, he notes, never was a tragedy written about the former. And he has a hypothesis. There are no tragedies about physical suffering, precisely because audiences cannot engage successfully on reflection, on engaging sympathetically, cannot really bring home to themselves the loss involved in physical pain. Whereas romantic loss is something that all spectators can bring home and be moved by. According to Smith, that induces not just in us, but in the impartial spectator, an imbalance in the importance, morally, we place on psychic loss as opposed to physical losses. But he goes on and he thinks fortune, fashion, rank, all also influence the imagination. That influences our imagination, but it also influences the impartial spectator's imagination. So that when you have an impartial spectator putting herself in the place of another person and seeing whether she approves of how that person is acting, her approvals are influenced by the actual effects, that's fortune. So it's a lovely chapter on moral fortune, which is bizarre and elegant in all sorts of ways. They're influenced by fashion, they're influenced by rank, and he clearly thinks there's nothing wrong with that. But an impartial spectator influenced by the difference between pains of imagination and physical pains, influenced by fortune, influenced by fashion, influenced by rank, is an impartial spectator whose approvals are not going to be up to the utilitarian standard. So you're not going to get utilitarianism out the far end from an impartial spectator understood as Smith understood the impartial spectator. Okay, so, next step. Prompted by Wealth of Nations, you might think utilitarianism is still in the offing. Because remember, in the Wealth of Nations, the actual interests of the people involved, what they were concerned to promote, was their own interests, not overall welfare. But the utilitarian justification of that more limited focus of agents in the market economy, the utilitarian justification of that involved pointing out how advantageous it was for us all to be in a society where we were each pursuing our own interest as long as it was structured by an appropriate market economy. So you might think of Smith. He grants the fluctuations, the peculiarities, the, what'd you call them, something biases? The here and now.
Yeah,
The here and now biases. He sanctions those as not inappropriate features of the impartial spectator on the grounds that each of us judging by such a standard will be led to act or to judge in ways that, not through our intentions, actually redound to overall welfare. So again, you might say, deep down, Smith was a utilitarian, or at least had available utilitarianism as the fundamental standard, in light of which he could justify, as appropriate, this peculiar standard for our moral concepts. A standard that wasn't the utilitarian standard on utilitarian grounds. That's exactly what he does in Wealth of Nations. Individual agents in the market economy are not at all judging on the basis of what will contribute to overall welfare, but justification for that, they're doing what they're doing, nonetheless results in a contribution to overall welfare. Similarly, you might think, okay, the impartial spectator is not equisympathetic at all, approving in proportion as we contribute to overall utility. But the impartial spectator, with or here now biases, is a standard, the using of which, by all of us, actually, though not on the basis of our intentions, contributes to overall welfare. And so utilitarianism comes in now at the back end as the fundamental criterion in light of which our standards of judgment are to be justified. There are several problems with this proposal as an interpretation of Smith. The first, and this will connect up, I think, importantly with Charles Griswold's worries about Smith, is when it comes to endorsing the impartial spectator, which is what we're talking about now. We're raising the question, what's so good about the impartial spectator? And we've got a candidate answer. What's so good about the impartial spectator is judging according to her reactions promotes overall welfare. When we have that answer, it can be an answer that engages us normatively only if we accept as a standard the utilitarian standard that we're appealing to. Otherwise, it would be like defending the impartial spectator on the grounds that if we all judge according to the impartial spectator, you know what will happen? There'll be 1 million more hot dogs in the world. You'll say, I'm not sure I believe that, but even if that's true, that's no defense of the impartial spectator. Promoting hot dogs is not a standard in light of which you show doing something is what we should be doing. Our question is, should we be making our moral judgments by appeal to the impartial spectator? This is the normative question. If our answer is, yes, we should because it will maximize overall welfare, we have an adequate answer. Only if maximizing overall welfare constitutes a normative standard for the practices we engage in. If Smith is right, it isn't. And it's important to see why this is plausible. If he's right that the impartial spectator is our standard for moral judgments, what you see immediately is he recognizes that not all pleasures, not all contributions to people doing better off by their own lives are worth anything. He thinks improper and unmerited benefit, so-called benefit, is normatively neither here nor there. So when he appeals to utility, which he does all the time, he restricts the appeal to utility as a normative consideration to cases where what something is useful for is promoting, specifically, proper and merited benefits. He's specifically, for instance, in favor of punishment, without counting the pain suffered by the person who's being punished against its justifiability, as long as the punishment is merited, which it will be if the resentment of the action being punished is not just approved, but approvable. So when someone says, Smith's view is the judging by appeal to the impartial spectator is the right standard to use because it meets this standard, what we must be adhering to has to be a standard we recognize as normal. But if he's right, the fundamental standard is the impartial spectator, that appeal to utilitarianism can't be right. But now you might worry. Well, let me stop for a second. Everybody following this next step? So I'll just tell you a little story of the paper up to now. Okay. You might think Smith is a committed utilitarian from The Wealth of Nations. Turn to a theory of moral sentiments and you immediately get a focus not on contributions to overall utility, but on approving as merited and proper. And then a distinction between being approved of and being approvable as merited the judgment that your action was meritorious or proper. That distinction is funded by an impartial spectator. You might think, oh, that's where the utilitarianism comes from. The impartial spectator is an ideal observer who's equisympathetic at all, episympathetic with all, and so her approvals will be extensionally equivalent to the demands of utilitarianism. But if you actually pay attention to Smith, he emphasizes that the impartial spectator is not equisympathetic, is actually subject to all sorts of peculiarities, the appeal to which is crucial to getting a plausible account that matches our actual normative judgments. But concerning which you might say, oh, I know where utilitarianism comes in, at the next level up, as a justification for using this non-utilitarian standard. which would be a plausible argument if you had independent reasons for thinking the utilitarian standard was an appropriate normative standard, not just a matter of maximizing hot dogs. The problem is, when you look at Smith's account of what our standard actually is, it's not that. For two reasons. The actual merit and propriety of actions do not depend on his view, on their impact on all who might be affected. They focus on those, as he calls them, who are principally concerned. Moreover, focusing on those who are principally concerned, they focus not on the pleasures and pains or the contribution to the welfare of the individuals that are at the heart of utilitarianism, because they specifically discount certain pleasures as not worth anything, certain contributions to welfare as positively, morally abhorrent. So the pleasures felt by a vicious person properly resented, that's not something that weighs out against the resentment as making things not as bad as they otherwise would be. They're morally irrelevant. So like Kant, Smith thinks not all pleasures, not all contributions to welfare are unconditionally good. They're all at best conditionally good, conditional upon their securing approval from an impartial spectator. So it looks like we just bottom out in Smith on the impartial spectator. But you could worry, and this was the worry I was going to ask you about and I raised at the beginning, you could worry that the impartial spectator is just, I don't know, one of many perspectives. Why not stick with your own selfish perspective? Why bother paying attention to what somebody who is not personally involved, informed about all affected, capable of putting herself in your position and her position? Why be concerned with that? Smith's first answer is, if you're asking a normative question, you have no choice but to appeal to the standards of your normative concept. There's no place else to go. Charles then points out that this looks like a scarily non-revolutionary view. It looks like it can't countenance the thought that the standards we're using could be corrupt in some way. Right, so that was one of the sub-themes of Charles's paper, that Rousseau was alive to the Platonic idea that everything we're actually doing, including the standards we're using for our concepts, may be shown to be defective. On the story I'm giving Smith, where things bottom out in the impartial spectator, not in utilitarianism, you might think, well, that's kind of flat-footed and doesn't give us any perspective from which we might criticize current practices on normative grounds. But it sure looks as if we better be able to do that. Now, Hutcheson explicitly embraced the idea that we can't possibly evaluate or criticize our fundamental moral sense. So I'll just read Hutcheson on this, if my iPad stays alive. Here's what Hutcheson wrote. No one, quote, can apply moral attributes to the very faculty of perceiving moral qualities, or call his moral sense morally good or evil, any more than he calls the power of tasting sweet or bitter, or of seeing straight or crooked, white or black. So Hutcheson's idea is, once you've found the criterion we use for the concept in play, so if it's a normative concept, the normative criteria, you've gotten to the end of the story. Smith, I think, to his deep credit, rejects this completely. So what he writes is, surely, and this is after talking about Hutcheson, surely if we saw any man shouting with admiration and applause at a barbarous and unmerited execution, which some insolent tyrant had ordered, we should not think we were guilty of any great absurdity in denominating this behavior, that is the cheering for this kind of punishment, in denominating this behavior vicious and morally evil in the highest degree, though it expressed nothing but... There's something wrong with what I wrote here. because it expressed nothing but depraved moral faculties, or an absurd approbation of this court action, as of what was noble, magnanimous, and great. So Smith's idea is we can reflect on our standard of moral judgment and ask of that standard, is it appropriate? But we can only do that using the standard we have in play. To ask, should we continue judging by appeal to this standard, inevitably requires, given the nature of the question, using the standard in question. But importantly, the answer isn't trivial. It can easily turn out that on reflecting on our own moral sense, we find normative problems with it and put ourselves in the position of thinking of the impartial spectator as she's currently constituted in our practice, that by her own standards she should pay attention to more things or different things. Now I think this feature, the valuability in normative terms of our normative standards, is a distinctive mark of normative concepts and sets it apart from all descriptive concepts. And I think if I can have like 3 minutes more, 2 minutes more, or am I done?
We have like 10 minutes left for questioning, so.
Okay, then I think so. There's
you
a
can answer your question with your.
yeah. I'll find a way to do that, no matter what people ask on. So the upshot of this story, if I'm right, is at every point you might try to inject utilitarianism as the standard, at least in some way in play in Smith, you will find that it never finds a comfortable home. That at most in Smith, appeals to utility, as crucial as they are always conditioned by reflection on what an impartial spectator would approve of as merited or proper. That's the conclusion of the paper.
Well, thanks to both of you for a fantastic, this is on, I don't know if it's on. I guess this is just a quick question about the sort of why be moral question that is floating around both talks. Good. And the appeal to an impartial spectator as a way of answering the question. So I think you put it wonderfully. Just the thought is, why should I care about the impartial spectator itself if it constitutes the standard of normative judgment? Well, if you're going to ask that question, you're going to deploy your normative concepts, and if our normative concepts are saturated with the impartial spectator, then the answer is going to sort of fall out. But then I thought, well, does it quite fall out? Because you need the substantive conclusion that the spectator will tell you to care about the spectator. And I was wondering just if either of you had any thoughts on this, because it doesn't seem, it's not analytic that the spectator would. Nope. So how will that why be moral question be answered by this particular appeal or this kind of appeal?
Excellent question. So my answer on Smith's behalf depends on the point you made. It's not analytic. It's not trivial. It's very possible. We do this all the time. We find ourselves with certain sentiments. Some of us do this all the time. You find yourself with certain sentiments. Then you reflect on them, and you find you disapprove of them. There's nothing in the story of the impartial spectator that guarantees that as she steps back and looks at her pattern of approval, she won't find herself disapproving of it. If that happens, then to our original question, should we keep relying on her? We'll get the answer, no, we should change. How should we change? In whatever ways at the next level up, she approves of the alteration. So it's an important point about the view I'm giving Smith. This is not a reflective endorsement view. It's not a view according to which you got it right as long as you approve of your own pattern of endorsement. It's a view according to which, first of all, you might not approve. And if you do approve, you've just dodged a bullet. You've dodged a reason to think you got things wrong. You haven't gotten evidence that you got things right. So I threw an extra bit in there, but.
I mean, can I?
Okay. Yeah.
I mean, I just maybe to point out to a difference. I mean, you bring in the normative concepts in some sense in the end, I think. I mean, from my perspective, I start out, I mean, not necessarily with Smith, but what I see in Smith is very, I mean, I see mirror my way of thinking about it. So I start out with agency in some sense and think about agents as so the self that we are talking about is a self that always can give an account of what he or she is doing. So agents are, and I think that that resonates with Smith, are accountable, but in very primitive sense. So you can give an account of why you are sitting here. And if you can't do that, then you're starting wondering about your agency. I mean, there's a wonderful book by somebody who just recently died of Alzheimer's. I forgot his name, but the title of the book is Losing My Mind. And he describes a scene where he is standing in front of the refrigerator and kind of not knowing what brought him here. And I always think that happens to you. Your wife tells you go down to the cellar and get something, and you start thinking about philosophical problem. You find yourself in the cellar and you wonder, why am I here? But if that happens to you too often, then there's something wrong with you. Now, that's a very low-level kind of giving. What I'm thinking is that this is intersubjectively accessible, and that's where reenactment comes in, right? So the self is basically accessible only through reenactment and sympathy. Now, at one point, we can't make sense of you if we are culturally or autobiographically so different. Now, then there is both a normative problem and an explanatory problem. I actually can't anymore make sense of you as an agent. So I somewhat, and that doesn't seem to make sense. But from the perspective of the agent, I actually challenge your own self. And so that's a problem. So then I take the other kind of perspective taking. Now, once I put myself in the other person's perspective, I say, okay, I now can make sense. But then I do have to ask the question, and what does that mean for me? I can say, is that way of thinking about the world something that I should maybe adopt? But that would mean throwing out all of the other kind of beliefs that I quarantine. So I reenact somebody who is a flat earther, right? And I think, okay, that makes perfectly sense from that perspective. But obviously I don't want to be a flat earther. It seems to be wrong. Now, when I make that judgment, I don't make that judgment only from my perspective. I want to say my perspective actually, impartially looked at, is the kind of right perspective. So when I have these two perspectives and I have to negotiate which of those perspectives I actually have to bring home to myself, then I think we kind of appeal to the impartial spectator perspective. I don't really need to do that in terms of, I mean, so what I want to say is the notion of acting for a reason that we negotiate puts in this kind of impartiality. And then I want to say, I mean, I actually think we can criticize Smith a little bit and saying some of the biases we really should get rid of. I mean, there's an argument. I mean,
so part of the real point of the question, I thought, was Smith better be able to acknowledge that on reflection we should get rid of some of the biases. Right. And that's part of the view I'm trying to give him, where that's an intelligible challenge. His own view in the book is, no, these are defensible biases. Right. And I think the cool thing is he's got an account that countenances the challenge, even though he thinks he has a satisfying answer to it. And that's what makes the challenge to the standard one with bite. It's not an analytic truth that our standard is going to endorse itself.
Thank you both for wonderful papers. I just wanted to ask Jeff two questions, really by way of clarification. So the first question has to do with the really the starting point of the Impartial Spectator in the developmental story that you rightly remind us of. Is it part of your account that what Smith is saying is that we start with what you could call a non-moral situation? There are feelings, there are sentiments, and it gets moralized by virtue of the introduction of the Impartial Spectator? Or would you say that morality, pre-impartial spectator morality, is already woven into, as it were, the fabric of ordinary, spectator reactions, and then it gets corrected as necessary by the impartial spectator? That's the first question.
Let me try to answer the first question first.
Yeah.
So, on my sense of Smith is he thinks morality is in the environment already.
Right.
But when you ask, what is it? What are the moral features of it? You're asking a question that relies on having moral concepts.
Yeah.
And on my reading, he thinks moral concepts are not on the scene until there's an impartial spectator.
Uh-huh.
So it turns out that we could treat each other in abominable ways, or we could watch people treat each other in morally abominable ways, and there would be among them no impartial spectator. The abominability consists in how they're treating each other. Mm-hmm. But when we then reflect on it and articulate the abominability, we're using the normative concept, and we need to have an account of what that concept is. So I see the developmental story as the story of the emergence of moral concepts. Concepts that don't have as a condition for their application possession of the concepts. That's probably the best way to put it. So once you have the concept of unjustly abusing someone, you have a concept that you can look at an interaction among people who don't have that concept and see of what they're doing, that they're unjustly abusing each other.
Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I completely would agree with that, only because his description of praise and blame that is there before we get to praiseworthiness and blameworthiness is already saturated with what looks like concepts, reasons, justifications. It's just that some of them are mistaken. And, we learn this when they get applied, as you pointed out, to us, and then realize, oh, that's, I didn't do that. I'm being unjustly accused. But the accusation is one that is deploying concepts of guilt, various norms, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I'm inclined to think not.
Just misapplied.
Yeah, I think I think the version is people resenting
Yeah.
and feeling bad, feeling guilty,
Right.
but they're not yet using the concepts.
Okay. Well, so
Okay,
the
we can talk
advantage
about
of the version that I'm telling is that you then don't have to explain how you get the rabbit out of the hat, because the concepts are already there.
Right.
I mean, you have to explain why you would start with a phenomenology in which they're already there, maybe, but you don't have to explain. I think it will help to dodge a kind of circularity problem that is built into your take on the developmental account. But that's one thing.
So
Yeah.
I share that point. I kind of admire, I think Hume was more explicit about this. Hume is trying to explain the emergence of the concepts.
Yeah.
I think Smith borrows the standard empiricist story.
Okay.
And so they've got this worry that I think you can defend, but
Okay.
Can I reconcile?
Please do.
good luck.
I mean, I think you're right that ordinary life is full of moral concepts. I mean, the story I give is more kind of a reconstruction of how we should think of why we are really committed to moral concepts. So we use moral concepts all the time. I think you're absolutely right. And we praise and blame all the time in all kinds of dimensions. But it seems to me the philosopher's task then is to say, on reflection, why is it that we are committed to those concepts? We use them already, but why should we be committed?
Right.
So it seems to me there's some kind of reconstruction going on the metaethical level that wants to say, not only do you use those concepts, but those are the reasons. If you reflect on it, you shouldn't get rid of them.
So I think young kids don't have the concepts. I think there's a crucial time in kids' life when they start protesting something's unfair. And at first, when they protest that it's unfair, they're really just expressing their dislike. And then they make it's very quick, interesting transition to where the protest becomes an objection, where they start to mobilize the concept of unfairness that's sensitive to all kinds of evidence that they weren't sensitive to before. And I think it's an advantage of a metaethical philosophical view, that it gives a story of that transition. But I think approving and disapproving is available to the kids before they have the normative concepts. So I actually embrace the challenge that you saying, well, an advantage of your reading is we don't have to speak to it. I think Smith tries to speak to it.